Peace and love, family. Welcome to another powerful Read Book Club discussion. Tonight we are discussing chapter 3 of They Were Her Property by Dr. Stephanie Rogers. I am your host, Dr. Ma'at, and normally my co-host, brother T. Wolo, is with me, but he said he's exhausted and he was going to try to join if he was up to it. So I know that he's going through some things and nothing negative, family. He's just tired, got a lot on his plate. And I think he just needed a break. And so anyway, family, I'm going to hold down the fort. I'm going to hold down the fort. I want to shout out some people who are in the building. I see you, Hotspot Casinos in the building. And I also see you, Blockchain, you're in the building. I know you're all probably saying, Dr. Ma'at is dolled up today. Why is she dolled up today? Well, today, family, we celebrated Baba Imhotep's 53rd birthday. And so I literally just came home, family, from that event. And it was beautiful. The brothers and sisters from PLM, Pan-African Liberation Movement here in Baltimore, gave him a celebration. And it was beautiful. He pours so much, family. He pours so much into the community. And sometimes, our leaders and our revolutionaries, we need to be poured into as well. And so it was just beautiful to me to just witness the community pouring into someone who gives so much, to the community. And so I watched his wife, speak about him, his children and children in the village. They got up and did a performance, for him. And you saw a different organization. Shout out to the brothers of TNAT, the Temple of New African Thought, which is under the leadership of Dr. Asar Winkler. He was there. He spoke. And you had Brother Jabari Nator of Reality Speak Survivors Nation. He got up and he spoke. And so it was just, again, just a beautiful celebration. And so I came from there. And so you all see that I can pull it together when I want to. I got to see a lot of people while I was there. Shout out to brother Davon. That brother always say he's the best dressed RBG soldier that we have. And so I saw him. He came up from Maryland Eastern Shore. There were some brothers and sisters there from different parts of Maryland. Shout out to my E5 twins. They came up with their family. They actually drove up from Florida. And to attend the event. And so we took pictures and did that. So I had to make sure, that I had it together. Usually I come on here, you already know I'm in the war. So I come on here sometimes in a t-shirt or a hoodie or a sweater, but I had to doll it up for this event. So anyway, I want to take a moment out. I see Blockchain. I see Hotspot Casino. I see you, Sister Crystal Denise. Peace and love to you, sister. Peace and love to you. I see a beautiful mind in the building. She says peace and love. So peace and love to you, Queen Mother. Thank you so much, Queen Mother. Yeah, I doll it up sometime. I could doll it up sometimes. Sometimes I think that y'all sleep on me a little bit, but I could doll it up when I want to. Peace and love to you. I see Sister Donette Mitchell. Greetings from North Carolina. North Carolina's in the building, family. I see Becky Brown is in the building. She says, so glad you're here. Oh, thank you so much, Becky Brown. Thank you. It was beautiful. Just, going to the event and having a good time. I see Queen Mother Almina's in the building. She said, good evening, Dr. Ma'at and family. Oh, thank you, Sister Donette. I appreciate your words. Family, take a moment out to like, subscribe, and share. That's what Queen Mother said. Share it with the world, all right? So make sure you come in here, family. Thumb up the video. Who else do we have in the building? 7 Scales, B1 all day. Peace and love to you. Who else we have in the building? Brother Steve. Brother Steve is in the building. Peace and love to you. Greetings from St. Louis. St. Louis is in the building. He said, look, CJ finally made it. He said, I'm in here tonight. And they messing with my count, family. On YouTube, it looks like on not on YouTube, on StreamYard side, it looks like 2 people are watching. And I know it's more than 2 people watching. Like they're really playing games with the numbers. But peace and love to you, CJ. He said, I'm in here tonight. Peace and love. Oh, thank you so much, Queen Mother. Appreciate your words, Queen Mother. Donette, so California's in the building. I see Queen Mother Virgo Venom. She's in the building. Thank you so much, Queen Mother. Let me see who this is. Shaddai. Peace, sister. Dr. Ma'at and family. Peace and love to you. Yeah, they messing with the numbers bad. But anyway, family, you already see the title. Tonight, we're going to be discussing, it says white female slave masters were just as brutal as their male counterparts. And so what I'm going to do is just really summarize, the chapter and then drop the link in the chat so you all can come in and kind of co-host with me and give me your opinions on, what you heard and what you think and what your research has brought you to conclude as well. But I want to give thanks to Dr. Rogers, Dr. Stephanie Rogers, for this book. They were her property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. This is history that is hidden, is not taught, so it's hidden. It has been hidden from us. They don't teach it, and I don't expect them to teach this history. But whenever slavery, let me take this gum out of my mouth. Whenever slavery is depicted by Hollywood, uh, you never ever see, the mistress of the house depicted as a slave master, right? It's always the white man, right? The white male, okay, that's always considered the slave master. You don't even hardly see footage of white women and even white children beating and brutalizing and just disrespecting enslaved people. Hollywood doesn't show it. And of course, you already know that in our textbooks, in educational textbooks, they're not going to teach that. They really do a great job at protecting the image of white women, and I feel like this book has literally knocked the lid off of it, right? Like just the information that we're learning. I mean, in the intro, we learned that 40%, and go back, family, all you got to do is, and a matter of fact, I could drop the links in the chat. Go back and look at the previous Read Book Club discussions on They Were Her Property. During the introduction, we learned that yes, white women, they owned captives too. I hate saying slaves, and we got to get that word. I got to get that word out of my vocabulary, calling our ancestors slaves, because they weren't slaves, right? These, our ancestors were enslaved, but these were human beings. And when we say slave, you don't think of a human being as like a thing. No, these were mothers, these were fathers, right? These were people. Okay, these were sons, these were daughters. And so when you say a slave, it's kind of like you relegate them to a thing. It's when you say slave, I feel like you're denigrating, we're denigrating their humanity, or we're stripping them of their human dignity. So we have to get out of that habit of saying slave, slave, slave. So they were enslaved, right? They weren't slaves, they were enslaved, they were captives. And so anyway, family, in the introduction, we learned that white women, and I want to say so-called, right? Because we know there's no such thing as a white person, right? So-called, right? Because whiteness is an invention. I'm going to say that again. Whiteness is an invention. So-called white women, they owned captives as well. And not only did they own captives, 40%, 40% of those slave masters or slave holding, that's what they call them. I'm just using the names that she called them in the book. They were women. They were so-called white women. And that's what we talked about in the introduction. In chapter 1, we talked about how, so-called white children, specifically so-called white daughters, were groomed to be slave masters, how they sat and they watched their parents, their mothers, their fathers interact with enslaved persons, and they recognize their superiority to enslaved persons. They recognize that with their complexion came a freedom. And so they were groomed. We talked about in chapter 1 the grooming. They were groomed to be slave holders, okay, slave owners, slave masters. That's what she calls them in the book. So then last week in chapter 2, we talked about, and let me go back, family, because I'm talking off the top of my head. Last week, I belong to the mistress. So that was the name of the chapter. So last week, she provided so many receipts to substantiate that white women did indeed, so-called white women did indeed own captives, because you have some historians who say no, they weren't really the masters, it was really the man, it wasn't the females. And so she had receipts. And so in chapter 2 she presented court cases of women taking their husbands to court. And these were men, because we talked about the doctrine of coverture last week. And it was essentially when a white man married a white woman, he automatically uh, had access to all of her assets that she inherited, gifts that she inherited. So he became controller, he was able to take control over that thing because of the doctrine of coverture. And so you had court cases where women went to court to establish separate estate from their husbands. They also went to court when husbands tried to um, um, take control of their estate and manage their estate, or when creditors would come up to their husbands, they couldn't get the money back from their husbands, that the creditors began to go after their wives' estate. And so in these court cases, these court records present evidence that so-called white women indeed owned captives. There were also ads in papers to substantiate that so-called white women owned captives. So there were ads in papers for runaways. And so they said this person belonged to Mistress Sarah, right? You know, Mistress Sarah or Mistress Betty or Barbara. And so anyway, there were court cases. So there were records to substantiate the so-called white women owned captives. And so tonight, family, in chapter 3 is entitled Mrs. Done Her Own Bossing. And so these were the words of our formerly enslaved people and the way they spoke. And what I love about Dr. Rogers is that she didn't change that. She didn't change that. She wrote down exactly how our ancestors spoke. And so one of our ancestors, who was a former enslaved person of a so-called white woman, said, Mrs. done her own bossing. And so I read half the chapter yesterday and read the other half today. And essentially, what he's talking about is that these white women did not let anyone, white men, their husbands, whether it's their husbands or overseers, get in the way of how they managed and disciplined their captives. They didn't have it. So that's why the enslaved person said, Mistress done her own bossing. So anyway, family, we learned last week that white households weren't as patriarchal as we thought they were. So in a lot of movies, family, in a lot of movies, they always depict, the white man as the head of the household. Very patriarchal. And what you learn, and shout out to Dr. Amos Wilson. I'm thinking about the book that he recommended, The Way We Never Were. Get that book, family, because that's a myth. When we think of white households, we always think of white men being the sole authority in their households, and white women are seen as submissive, right? They submit to these white men. And when you read this book, you find out this is far from the truth, family. This is far from the truth. These white men, a lot of them, they talked about how they ran off on their wives. They came into the marriage broke. And so these white women were running their households. And so in this particular chapter 3, Mrs. Done Her Own Bossing, it's really like a continuation of that discussion, right? She's really driving home that these white women who owned captives did not let their husbands, did not let family members, overseers stand in the way of how they managed and disciplined their captives. And so, anyway, it starts off with a story at the beginning. And usually I always throw it to Brother T to start it off. But it says right here in 1837, 3 years after Maria and Alicia, and I thought this was a female, but it's actually a male, Alicia Betts said their vows in Morgan County, Georgia, cotton fever swept over the state, catching up the couple. Like countless others, they moved west to their land. They moved west to try their hand, I'm sorry, at starting a plantation and establish their new home in Macon County, Alabama. It says the honeymoon phase of their marriage had barely ended. However, it says when the panic of 1837 caused Elisha's mercantile business to fail, he became heavily indebted and lost much of what he owned. But when he was down on his luck, he needed Maria's support the most and saw a side of his wife that surprised him. He reeled from the pecuniary losses. Maria did not seem to empathize with him as she should. Furthermore, she seemed unwilling to help him rebound financially. So I'm telling you, this is going to set the stage, family, for chapter 3. So it says, over the next 9 years of their marriage, the Betts never lived agreeably together. And by 1846, so we're talking 9 years later, Maria and Elisha had reached a crisis. Much of the discord between them had to do with the fact that Maria owned slaves in her own right and possessed the legal authority to decide what to do with them. Almost a decade before Maria married Elisha, and while she was married and separated from her first husband, Ambrose Nelson, her father, Moses Walker, had hired a lawyer. And remember, family, we learned this in previous chapters that when white women owned, and I had to cut the light on so I could see better. When white women owned um, captives, what their parents would do was write up a deed of gift, or they would draw up court papers to say that, okay, if she ever was to marry, that these people belong to her and her only, right? And she could do with them what she will. Okay. So he goes on to say that Moses, her father, okay, it says Moses Walker had hired a lawyer to draw up a declaration of intention that stipulated three things. That first, any property that Moses might give to Maria during her lifetime, during his lifetime, or at the time of his death, was to be hers alone. This would be the case wherever, and this is in quotes, covered or not, so married or not. Moses Walker also stipulated that all property he conveyed to her must be completely free from the marital right of her then present and future husband. Furthermore, the document empowered Maria to dispose of her property by will. If she died, if she died, estate, or so if she died suddenly, it says the property would descend to her children rather than her husband. At the same time, he drew up the declaration of intent. Maria's father gave her 3 of his slaves. He later gave her 3 more, so she had a total of 6. So it says, as Maria prepared to marry Elisha on September the 18th, 1934, she told him about her father's declaration of intention, and she made sure that he understood the limits it would place about his marital rights. And he agreed that she might hold as separate estate the property she then had or might afterwards get from her father. And she even reiterated the terms of the legal document at the wedding reception. Okay, so it goes on to talk about how Alicia, I know that sounds like a woman's name, but his name is Alicia. It says Alicia might have been willing to recognize Maria's property rights, but he still expected to take charge of her slaves. Maria would have none of that. She refused to let Alicia exercise mastery over them, at least not the kind he had in mind. Once they settled into their new home in Alabama, Maria was rarely pleased with Alicia's treatment of her slaves. According to the neighbor, Charles C. Mills, Alicia frequently complained about his wife and said that much of their misunderstanding grew out of jealousy on her part of his treatment of the Negroes given her by her father. Alicia, and this is in quotes, Alicia confessed to Mills that he could never chastise one of them without the wife's manifesting feeling and discontent. Alicia was putting it mildly. In his conversation with Mills, Alicia admitted that Maria was an excellent housekeeper, though she was inclined to be self-willed and not obedient to his wishes. So wait a minute, this kind of scraps the idea of white women being these submissive people, right? They submitted to their husbands. No, she didn't. No. She didn't treat him like the patriarch of the family. So it goes on to say, in her own talks with Mills, Maria accepted her husband's characterization of her disposition and tacitly accepted his other statements about her, but countered that Alicia had always sought to control her too much in her domestic concerns, even though she was perfectly capable of managing them by herself. By 1846, Alicia had decided that nothing could induce him to return to his wife or to live with her again. Acting on those settlements, he abandoned her and he moved to Louisiana. So he got out of there. So she goes on to talk about how Maria and Alicia had different ideas of what it meant to be married. To Maria, to be married meant that she still had free will and could do what she wanted to do. To Alicia, the husband, to be married meant that he had control or say so in what she did. And so we got to kill this narrative, family, that these white antebellum Southern households were happily, these were happy patriarchal units, because they absolutely wasn't. Okay, so it goes on to talk about their situation, and then there's a lot of examples that she gives showing how these overseers and white men, the overseers and the white men, and I'm talking about white husbands and white overseers, would discipline or try to discipline the captives of these white women, and how these white women would come in and they would step in and say, no, you won't do this without my consent. And they would fire overseers. They would take some of their husbands to court to ensure that they did not exert authority over their so-called property. So she gives a whole bunch of receipts and a whole bunch of examples of that on the subsequent pages. So they talk about that, and I'm not going to get into every single example. I'm just going to pull out the meat and the potatoes of this chapter, since I'm doing this holding down the fort by myself. But it says right here that, and I'm on page 60, it says other enslaved men and women recalled mistresses who meted out calculated, systematic, and rationalized violence and discipline, not a master's subordinates and surrogates, but the slave owners in their own right who possess the authority to do so. So then she mentions that they had these journals, family. There was a journal called the Bowes Review in the Southern Planter. And these were actual journals, weekly journals, bi-weekly journals that were published that taught people how to manage, their captives. And so it kills me today when you have fools on the internet who are saying that slavery never happened. It's all a lie. When you actually have publications, right, that were produced back then that even gave people techniques on how to manage their captives. And what came to mind, family, was the Willie Lynch letters. How many people remember the Willie Lynch letter that the Nation of Islam had put out there? And then years later, people questioned the authenticity of the Willie Lynch letter, regardless of whether the Willie Lynch letter was real or fake. They did have journals, newspaper articles that had columns that discussed the management techniques, the disciplinary techniques of slaveholding people. And so, anyway, she goes on to talk about historians and how historians say that no, white women could have never been slave masters, right? Because they don't have the physical power of men. They're not patriarchs, so they never could actually be with the males like a slave master. They could only be a mistress. And so they're saying that there was this argument she's saying that there was this argument between historians regarding whether or not women could actually be considered masters, right, instead of mistresses. Okay. And so then she does say at the bottom of page 61, there was a historian named William Foster. He says, for example, he contends that slave owning women developed and engaged in a uniquely female form of mastery in which they interacted with and disciplined enslaved people as they would their own children. That's something she said. He said. But she says this. She says, but if we look carefully at slave owning women's management styles, we find that they differed little from those used by slave holding men, and they rarely treated enslaved people like their children. Okay. So she goes on to say, Okay, it says the status, and she emphasized this point, and I want to emphasize this as well. She's talking about slave holding women. And she says their status as slave owners granted them access to a community that was predicated upon the ownership of human beings and afforded them rights they did not possess in their own realms of their life. I want to pause here, family. I want to pause here. If these women did not own property, they would not have had freedoms. Okay. There was a certain freedom that was attached to owning enslaved persons. And so, isn't it crazy, right? When you think about it, that the freedoms that these slave owning white women enjoyed was linked to our captivity. Isn't that sick? So without our captivity, they wouldn't have had the freedoms that they enjoyed. So their freedoms was linked directly to our captivity. Okay. So he goes on to say this. It says whether slave owners turned out to be effective managers of the enslaved people they owned depended on the broader communal, legislative, and judicial recognition of their power over the enslaved and a collective willingness to protect that power when it called into question when others threatened it. So I have underlined southern communities, lawmakers, and courts recognize slave owning women as individuals able to acquire and exercise mastery over enslaved persons as evident from laws passed through the South. Now, family, this is when the whole all the good white people, black folks kill me. There were some good white people, or white people try to say, well, all of us didn't own slaves. We all wasn't participating. The whole white community is guilty, whether or not they owned enslaved people or captives or not. Because it says right here, whether slave owners turned out to be effective managers of enslaved people they own depended on the broader community, legislative, and judicial recognition of their power. Think about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That Slave Act charged everybody in the community to capture runaway slaves. So slavery, and I'm thinking about a book that I've been reading on the Maroons by Dr. Alvin. I got it in there. It's in my room, family. But he said everybody participated in it. So you may not have owned people. You may not have owned people, right? But you participated in it. It would not have happened. Slavery would not have gone on as long as it did without the participation of the broader community in the legislation and judicial. So he goes on to say this. Okay, she gives an example. It says in Louisiana was found guilty of revolting. So let me go back, family. So it talked about Southern laws. Okay, it talks about Southern laws. Laws dating back to the colonial period routinely recognized the mistresses owned enslaved people in their own right. And it says, in these same laws acknowledge the fact that these women were capable of exercising mastery over the enslaved people they owned. In fact, Southern laws held the mistresses accountable for their slaves' misconduct. Are you listening to me, family? For example, when an enslaved person in Louisiana was found guilty of revolting or of a plot to revolt against his or her mistress, mistress, or of willfully and maliciously striking his or her mistress or the children of his or her mistress or white overseer appointed by his or her own to be superintended superintend said owner slaves so as to cause confusion or bloodshed, mistresses were required to report these acts to the state. And if the mistress were to willfully and intentionally neglect to give the information against or refuse to give up, her slave or slaves said, mistress shall upon conviction therefore forfeit and pay the sum of $500. In South Carolina, for example, if an enslaved person ran away, For a period of 20 days or more, masters and mistresses were required to publicly and severely administer up 40 lashes with the whip for the first offense. And if the slave owner failed to do so, the local constable would do it at the owner's expense. Okay? So it goes on to say the management of Negroes advice columns that appeared in agricultural journals. I mentioned this earlier, such as the DeBrow's Review and Southern Planters, suggest that many Southern white men coveted the role of slave master and yearned to rule over enslaved people, even those who were not them. Let me say something right here, family. I really feel like, and this is just me thinking about, um, just slavery. This chapter was really heavy for me. That's why yesterday I read some of it, and I put the book down, and I picked the book up again this morning. It was really heavy because it's talking about slave, and I'm just referring to what it says in the book, slave management practices. And so it talked about how our ancestors were treated, and people who know me know that weighs on me heavy. You would have thought that I was there. Sometimes I feel like I was on the plantation there, and I just came back. That's how connected I am to what happened. And so, I feel like slavery created an atmosphere for people who are sadists to explore like their evilish, devilish thoughts, like carry those evil and devilish thoughts out. So like if you're a sadist, like in that, like I feel like that atmosphere, right, that they created, where you had people who actually controlled and owned other people. I feel like it was like it was a heaven for sadists. It was a heaven for people who like to exploit, right? People who like to violate, people who like to brutalize, people who like to kill, people who like to cheat, people who like to rape. It was an environment that it was their playground. Like it was literally like their playground. So anyway, she goes on to say that she gives an example of Rosalie Calvert. It says she found out that her husband had no interest in being a master. So this was a guy. So this was a particular story that she's talking about, where there was a woman whose husband didn't want to have anything to do with being a master. Like he wasn't pressed, right? So in these journals, they're saying that in the Bow, in the Southern Planter, they're suggesting that a lot of Southern white men, they wanted to, they assumed the role of a slave master, and they wanted to rule over enslaved people, even people who didn't belong to them, right? But she's presenting another case where she's saying that wasn't always the case, right? Like there was an incident where there was a woman named Rosalie Calvert who found out that her husband had no interest in being a master, right? And it says that she wrote letters like to her sister Isabel, complaining about her husband's laziness and indifference to it all, right? Like he just didn't want to do it. So he was kind of like the exception. Okay. But it says, but men who conducted themselves like her husband occupied only one extreme on the behavioral spectrum. Far more frequently, spouses and overseers of slaveholding women, as well as public officials such as patrollers, gravitated towards the opposing end of this continuum. It says they often went far when disciplining these women slaves, and they challenged these women's authority to say how the enslaved people they owned would be managed and disciplined. And so she goes on to present a couple of receipts, some stories about where overseers again were fired, where the slave owning woman, she felt like the overseer went too far. There was times where a slave owning white woman's husband would go too far, and maybe right in the middle of disciplining, she would interject, right, or intervene right when the husband was disciplining the captive. Okay. And so she goes on to talk about that. And I'm on page 66 for whoever's um, reading along with me. But in 64 and 65, that's what she's talking about. Um, 66, I have written in the margin, legal localism. So she introduces this term called legal localism. And this is basically where, you know how you may have a law, and I'm just paraphrasing, family. Someone may have a law, or a law may be put out there, but the local folks will dictate how, whether or not that law is recognized or practiced or upheld. And so she does introduce this term called legal localism, as it pertains to a particular story. Um, as it pertains to a particular story of, let me go back, family. Let me go to the bottom of page 65. And so it says, a woman named Mrs. Harris, for example, hired out an enslaved boy she owned to various men in her community. On one occasion, the boy lashed, uh, clashed with the man who had hired him. And during the altercation, the boy knocked his employer in the head. The injured man summoned the community squire and constable. The two men stripped the boy, and the squire whipped him. The boy began to make so much noise that Mrs. Harris heard him, came out, and told the squire to turn him loose. She threatened to kill the squire if he struck her slave one more time, and she showed him her gun. Appalled by her challenge to his authority, the squire reminded her that they were acting within the law. Miss Harris retorted that she did not care nothing about the law, and warned the squire not to hit her slave again. In the face of her defiance, the men saw no choice but to comply. They released the boy. This standoff between the neighborhood squire and Mrs. Harris suggests the communal custom may have shaped the operation of the law at the local level far more than the state did. Right? A phenomenon that the historian Laura Edwards referred to as legal localism. Right? It says the larger community may have subscribed to certain forms of discipline that constrained the squire's power to inflict punishment under certain circumstances. And so that is what she that's the context behind why in which she introduced this term legal localism. Now I find it funny. I'm at the bottom of page 67, where she talked about white servants, and had, so back then, not only did you have enslaved people, but you had white people, indentured servants, right? Like white indentured servants. And so she tells this story at the bottom of page 67, where she talks about how, like, this female owner had hired a white servant to work alongside enslaved people that she owned. And it says her management style could take a surprising turn. It says when Joe High was a young boy, he strolled through a potato patch, dug a spud out of the ground, and asked the white women who served as his mistress cook to prepare it for him to eat. So he takes this, right? He takes this spud out of the ground. He goes to this white woman who's a servant, and he says, "Cook this for me." So here it is, a white servant, right, is appalled because this Negro boy, right, or this nigger boy, is what they would have called him, asks her to cook something for him. And so it says the white woman marched the boy and his potato to the owner, Clara Griffin, and accused him of stealing it, telling Griffin, "Look here, Mrs. Look here, Mrs. Joe has been stealing taters." And it says, "Here's the tater he stole." And she probably expected a different response from the one she received. Instead of punishing Joe High, Griffin replied, "Joe belongs to me. That tater belongs to me. Take it back and cook it for him." So she was surprised that, I guess she thought, because of her whiteness, that that she was better than the enslaved, this indentured white woman, so-called white woman, white servant. She thought she was better than the enslaved person. But you clearly see in this particular story, this mistress, or this slave holding white woman, viewed the white servant on the same level. She put them on the same level as the enslaved person. And so it says the mistress told her, "Take it back and cook it for him." It says, in approaching her employer and accusing the boy of theft, this white servant was claiming a distinction between herself and the slaves who worked alongside her. Griffin's response to her actions suggests that Griffin may have thought the cook was placing herself on terms of equality with her mistress. That's what she thought. And she found it necessary to reinforce the class and power distinctions between them. So the mistress was saying, "You're not on my level. You're a servant." Okay. And it says, in the end, such differences tilted the outcome of the incident in Johai's favor. All right. So it goes on to talk about, it says, so there were some similarities between men and women's systems of management. Okay. It says it becomes clear through the testimony of formerly enslaved people. So it gets into family, she starts talking. I'm talking about from page 68 and on. She gets into, how, again, so what I love about Dr. Rogers is this. What I love about Dr. Rogers is this. She's very, very objective in how she disseminates information. So she first shows you how there were times when overseers, like white male overseers, white husbands, when there were times when the slave holding or slave owning white women intervened, right? Intervened during when the captives were being disciplined, by the white husbands and overseers, and the white woman felt like they were going too far, right? And she would intervene and say, "Stop." But now she's going to get into times where not only was slave owning women beating enslaved peoples with cowhide whips, leaving lashes, there were times where mistresses actually killed enslaved persons. There were times where mistresses actually killed enslaved persons. And she talks about that, family. So I'm gonna look for some stuff, and some stuff, family. I had to put the book down. I'm telling you, I had to put the book down. I wrote in the margins, sad. Okay, sad. And sometimes, these slave holding women and men would deputize, an enslaved person. So she talks about that at the bottom of page 68 and at the top of page 69. They would deputize an enslaved person to do the beating for them. Okay. And it says, by delegating brutal forms of slavery, brutal forms of masteries to subordinates, slave owning men and women cleansed themselves of the dark taint that subsequently stained the men who carried out their orders. So there were times where, the mistress, or the master would not brutalize an enslaved person. They would get another enslaved person to do that. And we've seen that like on movies and things of that. We've seen that on movies, or movies depicting slavery where they would have an enslaved person do the whipping for them. I love at the bottom of page 69 where it talks about this story where there was an auntie who pulled out the genitals. She actually killed two white overseers. It says she grabbed them by their private parts and pulled them out by their roots. And so it says this happened at Pauline House. It says Pauline House. So that was a formerly enslaved person. Pauline House enslaved aunt, it said, killed two white overseers, And so anyway, family, you had resistance like that. Okay. And so I'm at the top of page 70. I'm scrolling down to see if there's anything I want to pull out of here. See if I want to pull out here. I see that I did highlight something here that says, regardless of what formal laws said about slave patrollers' rights to discipline slaves in their communities, and no matter how much authority the law afforded the slave patrols, these slave owners, men and women alike, had created systems of management of control that denied power to these men. Okay, so that's, yeah. It says the regime of slavery could not have been sustained if the power, and we talked about that earlier, if the power, authority, and violence that characterized it had belonged to elite white men alone. It required modes of flexible power. Okay, so let me tap into this. I want to read these couple of lines because she introduces this concept of heterarchy. Heterarchy. Okay, let's look at this. It says the hyper surveillance the regime required was possible only if every white person, be it man, woman, child, slave owner, or non-slave owner, had the potential power to make an enslaved person obey him or her and submit to his or her will. and the law so empowered them. Such systems of shared power did not typically characterize hierarchical societies where the white men sat at the apex. They existed in societies that could be considered hierarchy in nature. Wait a minute. Did you all catch that at the bottom of page 70? That they did not exist. See, get the book, it's behind me. I'm gonna show you all the book before we get out of here. The Way We Never Were. I think a lot of us we spend time watching TV and allowing them to brainwash us to think that these, in the antebellum Southern households, they had these happy patriarchal units where the white man sat at the table and he made the decision and the woman was submissive. That is not true, family. Dr. Rogers tells us at the bottom they existed in a hierarchical society, a hierarchical society where there was shared power between the women, the men, the children, the slaveholders, and the non-slave holders, family. The non-slave holders, family. So it wasn't this hierarchy that we think the white man, then the white women, then the white children. No, they created a society where all of them shared power. And then it's, so what's sad is we sit here and we striving. We've made white people our standard, right? So we're striving in the black community, because I hear the brothers say, well, we're in a patriarchal society, the man is the head. And so we're striving to meet a standard that they don't even meet, a standard that they don't even practice. At the top of page 71, it says hierarchy allows power to be shared in a number of ways, not just vertically, but also horizontally. And enslaved and formerly enslaved people spoke of slave owning households that were structured in this way. So power was shared. In our black households, the parents have all the power, right? The children don't have any power. They can't say anything. Do what I say, right? Nah, in these societies, in these family units, power was shared. And let me let you in on a little secret. Jay, you there? You good to go? Okay, because I wanted to bring you on to ask you some questions. So when you get done, come in here. Okay. Yeah, power was shared in my household. Everybody has say so. The adults, the children, we live in that type of household. We all have say so. And that's the households that they lived in. Power was shared between all of them. So it says right here, I'm at the top of page 77. I'm saying, sorry, 71. It says, although in most studies of slavery, the underlying assumption is that only male heads of household exercise mastery over enslaved people. Formerly enslaved people forthrightly challenged this view. Formerly enslaved people spoke about households in which the slave owning couples owned enslaved people independent of each other, that is, in their own right. They spoke of households in which slave owning couples exercised what they call double mastery. It says each spouse had his or her own style of slave management and discipline styles that could be complementary or incompatible. And when their styles clashed, conflict was often the result. And so she provides us with some examples of how you may have had, a husband who owned, people, he owned captives. He may have managed his captives differently from his wife. So he may have managed them more gentle or even more brutal, and vice versa. So you had those sort of situations. And then you had some formerly enslaved people. You had some formerly enslaved people who said sometimes, they were in situations with husband and wife couples where the husband may tell you do something one way, the wife will say do it another way. So they were kind of in a crossfire between, the mistress and the master and the mistress. And so they talked about that. Okay. And then she gets into, this is what she gets into. I'm at the bottom of page 71, where she talks about, I'm talking about Dr. Rogers, talks about the different, instruments of discipline, where sometimes you had, the men, they might use the cowhide whip to whip our ancestors. And sometimes the women would use what they called a needleweed whip, or lash, or where they were whipped what they called the needleweed. So it says Miller, who was an formerly enslaved person, it remembered, that it burned. And so there were some small hairs, it says, that covered the stems of the needleweed. And so, when you got whipped with that, and when that infected area was rubbed, it burned, as opposed to being whipped. And they call it a needleweed branch, but as opposed, I said lash earlier, but the needleweed branch. But as opposed to the cowhide whips, it says they were notorious for cutting open the flesh. So how sometimes when we watching those movies and our ancestors are being whipped, they were whipped with the cowhide whip, and it says it would cut open the flesh. It says causing debilitating injuries that could lead to the enslaved person's death. Even when the victim lived, the whip left horrible scars that often decreased the price of prospective buyers. Prospective buyers were willing to pay for him or her. So sometimes, and this is what Dr. Rogers talks about, sometimes the female slave owners prefer to whip their captives with the needleweed branch because it would get the job done, right? You would inflict pain on your captives, but it wouldn't leave marks. And so they were very calculated. And she drives that home in this chapter. A lot of the slave owning women were very, 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 very calculated. And so she's thinking down the road, if I want to sell this person, right? And she didn't think about persons, she thought property. But if I want to sell my property, I want to make sure that I didn't leave marks. And so she was very, white women were very strategic about that. So the white men would be beating, our enslaved ancestors with cowhide, which left lashes. And then they wouldn't be able to sell and get top price for that person, right? Or for that captive. But those white women were very calculated. So that's why they preferred to use nettleweed branches. But in the middle of page 72, it says husbands frequently disagreed with their wives' chosen disciplinary strategies because they were too brutal. So now she's giving a flip side. So she's talking about, Stephanie Rogers, Dr. Rogers, first she talked about how sometimes white women, there were times, there are stories where white women, they weren't, they did not allow their captives to be brutalized by their husbands and by the overseers, and how sometimes when they did discipline them, they didn't use the cowhide, they used the nettleweed branch because it didn't leave marks, So, but now she's getting ready to give us the flip side, where sometimes you had husbands who looked at these women and said, "You're crazy," right? It says husbands frequently disagree with their wives' their choice of disciplinary strategies because they were too brutal, and they were not always willing to dole out punishment on their wives' behalf. It says slave owning husbands sometimes found their wives' violence towards enslaved people so disturbing that they could not ignore it and felt compelled to intervene. Okay. So let me give you this story. And this really, family, broke my heart. It says Penny Thompson's master, Calvin Ingram, would fight with his mistress lots of times about the treatment of the slaves they owned. He just wouldn't let her abuse them. George G. King, who lived 6 miles northeast of Lexington, South Carolina, recalled that master talked hard words, but mistress whipped. In fact, his mistress was a great believer in the power of punishment. She would whip his mammy till she was just a piece of living raw meat. Family, this hurt me to my core when I read this. He said that he witnessed his mother being beat until she was a piece of raw meat. Okay? He would whip his mammy until she was just a piece of living raw meat. It says, even King, though only a child, frequently felt the cut of her lash. Her husband tried to intervene, but ultimately powerless to stop her. She was so cruel that her husband tried to sell George King to prevent his wife from abusing him further. But his mistress owned the slaves, and this is in quotes, and they couldn't be sold without her say so. When King's mistress discovered her husband's plan, she prevented the sale swiftly retaliated. As King and his master, listen to this family, as King and his master were forced to stand and watch, the mistress commanded the overseer to strip, blind, and whip his mother. Or do you understand what's happening right here? So there was a little boy whose mother used to get brutalized, and he also used to get brutalized and beat. And her husband, okay, he didn't own them, he didn't own those captives, but he didn't like what was going on, and he wanted to stop this little boy from being abused. So he was going to just sell him, okay, to somebody else just to stop his wife from abusing this little boy. And so when the wife found out, she blocked the sale because remember, at the end of the day, white women own the property. And so the property, the captives, the enslaved persons could not be sold without the consent of those white women. When she blocked the sale, after she blocked the sale, what she did was go get this little boy's mother, brought the little boy's mother out in front of him and the husband who attempted to sell the little boy. And it says she commanded the overseer to strip, blind, and whip his mother. The beating, this is in quotes, left her laying all a shiver on the ground like a wounded animal dying from the chase. King remembered his mistress walking away laughing while his mommy screamed and groaned. His master had remarkably different response. He stood there looking sad and wretched, like he could feel the blows. One woman's violence towards her slaves was enough to drive her husband to abandon her. When he left, he took all the slaves he owned with him and left him there with the three she had brought into their marriage. Family, that was sad. That was sad. There's another instance where, at the bottom of page 73, where they talk about this particular slave master. Her name was Elizabeth. It talked about how she was very violent and her husband would try to stop her from whipping slaves and how she refused to feed her slaves. Dr. Rogers tell us that, Elizabeth used to starve her slaves. She calls it near starvation conditions. Okay, it says the enslaved children on her plantation didn't receive any meat because they didn't work. And it says one time a former slave remembered that a man had brought some old hog heads and pieces of fresh meat, like it says, like that to the old mistress in a barrel. So he bought some old hog heads and pieces of meat to make some soap with. And what she did was give the meat to the children. How cruel is that? To the point where the guy came back and said, man, the guy that gave it to her, these old hog heads, he in a barrel, he's like, I gave you that stuff so that you can make soap with it. He said, I had no idea you were going to give it to these children. He said, I wouldn't give it to my dogs. So that's how cruel this woman was, family. Not only did she beat the enslaved person, she was extremely violent. She kept them in near starvation conditions and fed them old hog heads. She gave it to the children. All right, family, I'm almost finished because it's only eight. It stops on page 80. I'm on page 75 or 74. So it says right here, family, going further, there was another incident, and I wrote sad on this. It says a formerly enslaved woman's new mistress who owned enslaved people in her own right exhibited particular disdain for her husband's slaves. So it says once she moved into their conjugal home, she removed her husband's female slave from the house, reassigned her to field work, and replaced her with one of the slaves her mother gave her when she married. So it says on one occasion, a calf found its way under the house and made water. So a calf went under the house and urinated, right? So it says the mistress accused two young boys who belonged to her husband of relieving themselves under the house instead. She waited until her husband was away from the house, then bound the boys in the kitchen so they could not get away. She pulled up a chair, sat down, and ordered her slave to beat them. The beating became so brutal that all of the slaves on the place was crying. One of the enslaved men ran to his master and told him what the mistress was doing. The master returned home as quickly as he could, but discovered that his wife had locked the door. He demanded that she open it, and she refused. Eventually, he had to break the door down. By that time, too much damage had been done. The boys were so traumatized that they couldn't even cry when he got there. One boy died 2 days later, and one died within 1 month. Within 1 month, family. And I wrote in the columns, you can see where I put stuff. I don't know if you can see it. I wrote sad. It's sad when you read these stories, what our ancestors had to witness, what they had to experience, what they had to go through. So it goes on to say that mastery and domination masqueraded sometimes as kindness and benevolence. Slave owners' indulgence, allowances for free time, concerns for preserving the integrity of enslaved couples and families, refusal to sell those they owned, and countless other behaviors and choices appeared to be acts of humanity. But in reality, they were calculated decisions made to enforce submission or preserve an enslaved person's value in the slave markets. So now she's going back to saying that, on the other extreme, on the other end of the spectrum, you had, white slave masters and white slave masters who were considered, oh, he's a kind master, right? But what makes him a kind master? He gives us free time. He doesn't sell our children, or she doesn't sell our children. They don't starve us. We eat well. But Stephanie Rogers says that all of this was really calculated decisions made to enforce submission or preserve an enslaved person's value in the slave markets. So it had no idea. They weren't really being kind. They didn't even view you as a human being. So they weren't being kind to you. It was a strategy. So anyway, she goes on to talk about threats of sale and how sometimes, in addition to beating enslaved people, just threatening to sell people, was more effective than beatings, right? Because no one wanted to be separated from their families. We didn't want to be separated from our families. So sometimes just saying, stand right there. Well, put on a because you put on a shirt or something, man. All right. So sometimes um just the thought, family, of someone selling your husband or selling your children, right? You would submit to their will because you don't want your family being broken up. And can you imagine, family? You already been, imagine the our ancestors who came in, I'm talking about, who experienced the Middle Passage and came here and went to the Caribbeans. And most of us went to the Caribbean, by the way. Went to South America. We went to the Caribbean. I think they said only 10% of the cargo came to the Americas. But anyway, family, can you imagine how important family became to them when they finally met somebody and had children? I'm talking about that first generation of Africans that were brought here, right? Can you imagine how important family became to them, when they found somebody and began to, because you already stripped of your homeland, your culture, your family there. You were disconnected, and you were brought into an environment where people, they don't share your same culture, they don't speak like you. You're working from can't see to can't see. So family was very, very important. Family became very, very important to us, right? Family became very important to us because we didn't want to be disconnected. And hold tight, family. I wanted to bring my son here. He's in here now. Say what up to the people, JJ.
Hotep, hotep.
Hotep. So we were talking about in the book club Going back to page 70, there's this term where they talk about, instead of hierarchical societies where power is shared here, right? So you're in the house, it's the man, then it's the woman, then it's the children. So there's this hierarchy, right? She's talking about this concept of hierarchy where the power is shared in the household. Now, let me ask you a question. I want you to speak honestly. Do you feel like you have no power living in this household? You can't make no decisions.
That is not true.
Don't say it to the people. I want the people.
That is not true.
So that's not true. So you do have power.
Yes.
Oh, so do you? So when you say you have power, what kind of power do you feel like you have? Do you feel like you're included in like household decisions?
Yes. And you always take me places, and you always give me my own decisions and choices as well.
You have your own what?
Decisions and choices.
You make your own decisions and choices. But when you make your decisions and choices, we have conversations about consequences, right?
Yes.
So with every choice or decision comes a consequence, right? And sometimes the consequence may feel good.
May feel some bad.
It may feel bad. But at the end of the day, you have a what?
Decision.
You have a choice. You have a choice. So you feel like you're in a situation, you don't feel like it's power, like it's my way or the highway, Jalen. Oh, I pay the bills. Oh, like it's not that situation, is it?
No.
You have your why are you laughing, Jay? No, but I'm just saying. I'm just saying, but like
it's the way you described it. It's all
okay. But I'm just saying you don't feel like it's that situation. Like this is my house. Do I knock on your door when I enter?
Yes.
Why do I knock on your door when I enter your room?
Because of privacy.
Because of privacy. Is that your room?
Yes.
That's your space. Okay. And so it's a level of privacy. Do I touch any of your things without your permission? Do I just come in and just touch your stuff?
No.
What do?
You ask.
I ask for permission. And then I expect you to do what?
Ask for permission.
Absolutely. When you come into my room and when you touch my things. Okay. So we share power in this household. Is that not true?
Yes, that is true.
Okay. All right. That's what just wanted the people to understand. Okay, Paul. Thank you, man. All right, family. All right, family. So I mean, there it is. I mean, so I had to, I wanted to prove that point right there, that we got to stop this hierarchy in the household and understand that we all share power in the household, right? Adults have powers, elders have the power, the children have the power. It's not that it's my way or the highway type of mentality. And these white folks, that's what they were doing back then. They were living in a hierarchy. It says hierarchical households where power was shared between the husbands, the wives, and the children. So anyway, family, I'm on page 75. I'm almost there. So we're talking about threats, right? And it says threats of sale could sometimes be more effective than beatings. She also talks about at the bottom of page 75 that management of Negro columns in agricultural journals. Again, she mentioned this like 3 or 4 times. Like the DeBow Review and Southern Planner make it clear that many members of the master class assumed that their compatriots did consider violence as a tool that helped them achieve mastery over enslaved people. So in these journals, they did advocate, or did support that, yeah, you should use violence as a tool. It'll help you achieve mastery over enslaved people. And there were pieces that they did right on that. Okay. But they did caution people. It says the writers advised their fellow slave owners to punish in moderation and not with severity, and reminded them that the infliction of punishment, it should be born in the mind that the objective is correction. Okay. And it says such cautionary advice suggests that brutal discipline as such was not perceived to be the problem, but rather the unceasing use of such violence. Now, in this other book that I was reading, they were saying that, the slave owners kind of, when it comes to violence and these strategies, they had to exercise, like they had to utilize a happy medium, right? So you don't want to brutalize your captives to the point where you're leaving marks on them. So if you go to resell them, you won't get money from them. Or that if you brutalize them, right, and you utilize these violent tactics, that increased your chances or the probability that they're going to run away. So there were, some discussions regarding that in another book that I'm reading. But anyway, it says in the third installment of the 1853 issue of the Planner Elite, Cecilia published an article titled Management of Servants. It says in a short survey, Again, I keep thinking about the oh my goodness, what was the letter again, guys? The Willie Lynch letter. Because they really had journals and publications that talked about how to manage enslaved people. Like that's real. Now the Willie Lynch letter, we don't know whether Willie Lynch existed, but we do know these journals existed. So anyway, it says Cecilia, she offered guidance to women who might be experiencing trouble managing their slaves. Cecilia recognized that women were capable of possessing and exercising the power to make enslaved people submit to their will. And she instructed them, okay, to met out punishment themselves. She advised, never scold when a servant neglects his duty. Okay, never scold when a servant neglects his duty, but always punish. She said, always punish, no matter how mildly, for mild treatment is the best. Severity hardens them. Be firm in this, that no neglect go unpunished. Never let a servant say to you, I forgot. Finally, let regularity mark every action, and consequence will be that everything will be done in its right place and at a right time, and the comforts and happiness of the family will be secured. So Cecilia not only advised her female readers to inflict punishment, she also recommended that they develop a system by which they could do it with regularity. She advised them against impulsive and sporadic acts of violence, suggested inflicting discipline in a systematic and calculated ways. All right. So now we're going to get in and it's going to close out with a discussion on Southern laws. So it says right here that Southern laws did not offer a clear or universal definition of what constituted cruelty in the context of slavery. Phillips Toker, the Justice of Peace for St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, argued that it was not possible to craft a single legal definition of what constituted cruelty in all cases. Okay, so there was this particular case called Walker versus Cruella. So it says a case involving the rescission of a slave sale. Toka argued that, however severe the chastisement may appear to certain persons, it was acceptable if it was done within the limits of prescribed law. Moreover, he opined punishment must necessarily depend on the circumstances of each case in particular. And if the case was a grave one, the chastisement will be severe. For example, if a slave is of robust constitution, the chastisement may be increased in proportion to his strength compared with the gravity of his faults. Everything depends on circumstances of which the owner is the judge. Do y'all hear what this? Do you hear what this justice is saying? That when an owner inflicts punishment on an enslaved person, the owner is the judge. Okay, on the level of cruelty or the level of brutality, that the owner is the judge. This is what the judges are saying, family. So it says right here, the owner is the judge. The law alone prescribes to him the instruments. The law alone prescribes to him the instruments of punishment to be made use of, and forbids him to the right to punish, so as to maim, mutilate, disable, or put in jeopardy, imperil his life. If the law was otherwise, the right of discipline would be illusory. So it says most states were in agreement. As long as the punishment did not maim, mutilate, and endanger the life of an enslaved person, brutality was legal. So it says there were, however, exceptions that allow whites to kill enslaved people. That's right, family. Thank you, Sister Crystal. She said casual killing act. Thank you. There were laws. White people were protected under the law. White slave owners were protected under the law. They could brutalize our ancestors, and they could get away with killing our ancestors. So it says right here, with impunity. South Carolina declared it lawful for any white person to beat, maim, or assault a black person, and if such Negro or slave cannot otherwise be taken, to kill him. Let me put this right here. Look it up, family. South Carolina declared it lawful for any white person to beat, maim, or assault a black person, and if such Negro or slave cannot otherwise be taken, to kill, who shall refuse to shoe his ticket, or by running away or resistance shall endeavor to avoid being apprehended or taken. When a slave owner's methods of punishment did maim or kill, the laws in states like Mississippi and South Carolina included provisions that absolved them of any wrongdoing. So it says right here, and this is important, family, if a Mississippi owner swore on oath that they had not intended to cause the slaves' deaths, or claimed that the death was caused by an accident or misfortune, and lawfully correcting a servant, or in heat of passion, upon any sudden or sufficient provocation, courts would typically acquit them. Let me keep reading. If the slaves they own inflicted punishment on their owner's behalf, they too would be acquitted. So that means that if the slave owners killed the enslaved people, they could be acquitted. Or if the slave owners told an enslaved person to beat another enslaved person and the other enslaved person ended up dead, they also got acquitted. Where are the receipts? In 1847, Elisa Rowan became the first woman in the state of South Carolina to be put on trial for the murder of a slave. She was accused of commanding her husband's slave, Richard, to strike an enslaved woman named Maria multiple times on the head with a block of wood, a beating that eventually led to Maria's death. South Carolina law stipulated that if a slave died as a result of a master's punishment and no other white persons were present to witness the incident, the slave owner could exculpate him or herself by claiming that the violence had not been inflicted maliciously. Elisa Rowland told the court that Maria had misbehaved that morning and she had ordered Richard to take her to Mr. Rowland's, her husband's house, to be corrected. She did this knowing that Mr. Rowland was absent from the city. She also claimed that Richard never punished Maria on her command and that no beating took place in her chambers. In fact, Rowan claimed that she had no idea who inflicted the blows that killed Maria. Even so, as law permits, by calling on God, exculpated herself. Exculpated herself. Calling on God. Do you hear this, family? Calling on God. She exculpated herself. She swore on the Bible, family. She swore on the daggone Bible, family, that this didn't happen. You know, she didn't die like this, and she got exonerated. Okay, the top of page 78, it says similar incidents went unnoticed by Southern press and have escaped scholarly attention for a number of reasons. The majority of these women's crimes against their slaves remain confined within their households, and more often than not, enslaved people were the only witnesses. And we got to remember, back then, family, you couldn't testify. It was against the law to testify against a white person. So if you're an enslaved person and a white person, whether slave owning or not, or non-slave owning, killed someone in front of you, and it's another enslaved person in front of you, you couldn't testify against them. And if no other white person witnessed it or wasn't willing to say anything, that person got off scot-free. So it says on January the 1st, 1824, Marshall Mann hired an enslaved girl named Fanny from Charles C. Tribble with the provision that he could purchase her once the contract for her hire expired. And so this enslaved person, she ended up dying because this guy's mistress, killed this woman. And guess what it says, family? They called her death. They swore, they went to court because the person was saying, hold up, you owe me some money. I hired her out to you. She's over there with you. You all end up killing her. It was actually the masters, the guy who hired the enslaved woman, his mistress killed her. And so the people who owned it said, well, you owe me a couple of dollars. And they took him to court. They took him to court to get their money. This fool gets on the stand and says her death was a consequence of an act of God. Family, these were devils. Family, these were devils. Who gets on the... All right. So it says, he says her death was a consequence, an act of God, something that dissolved man's liability. The court disagreed and ruled in Trebon's favor. Man appealed. It says his acquittal in the case of Fanny's death in the lower court. The Missouri Supreme Court dismissed man's appeal and uphold. So he ended up having to pay. But it's just crazy that he got on the daggone stand and called the enslaved person's death a consequence of an act of God. So anyway, families, it says one thing remained unsaid in all a man's case. His wife was responsible for his death. I already told you all that. Okay. At the bottom of page 78, and I'm bringing it to a close, family. We only have 2 more pages. It says, by some accounts, white slave owners concealed their most brutalized slaves from observers who might object to their violence, even going so far to borrow healthy slaves from neighbors when they entertained visitors. So sometimes you had slave owners that brutalized their slaves, right? Brutalized their captives, beat them, right? But when people came around, they would show the healthy ones, or they would borrow healthy ones from other people and say, look how I'm treating my captives. I'm treating them like, I'm treating them decent. I don't brutalize them. When I thought about this, it made me think of how, remember entertainers in like during the World War I, World War II, and shout out to Dr. Jared Ball in his book, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. Dr. Ball talked about the way mass communications or media, he talked about the birth of media, of mass communication by Edward Bernays. And he talked about that. And he said what they used to do, because he said the U.S., the U.S. wanted to spread democracy and capitalism. And so he said they used to take entertainers, right? So black folks that had a couple of money, they had some couple of dollars, the healthy slaves, and they would send them to like places like Europe, like different countries in Europe. They would send them over there and say, look. And so in these people's opinion, they thought all black people were living well, right? Because of these black entertainers who would go over there and perform, and they would smile and they would dance and they would talk about how great, America was. And we're talking about in the 40s and 50s. This is Jim Crow, right? Where segregation was at an all-time high, and where black poverty was the norm, right? Where black poverty, impoverished communities was the norm. But they took black entertainers, they used black entertainers in order to project the image that America was great for all people, right? And that's how they really push. Look, we live in a democratic society. This is democracy. We're practicing democracy, because if they really knew the truth about how black people were treated during that time, they would have said, we're not buying your democracy and your capitalism. Look at how you're treating your people right there in the U.S. So when I read this statement, family, I said, damn, ish doesn't change. It says, by some account, white slave owners concealed their most brutalized slaves from observers who might object to their violence, even going so far as to borrow healthy slaves from neighbors when they entertain visitors. Okay, so now I'm bringing it to a close. It says enslaved persons' deaths were not complete financial losses. Listen to this, family. Enslaved people's deaths were not complete financial losses to their owners. Medical schools across the nation bought bodies of deceased enslaved people from Southern slave owners for dissection and research, and thereby offered slave owners a profitable way to make such bodies disappear. So all of these medical schools, Johns Hopkins, Princeton, Harvard, these PWIs that you want to send your child to because you think they're going to get a better education, You think they're going to get a better education over there? These medical facilities, they were experimenting. See, you all thought our ancestors were crazy. They were They were getting bodies, deceased bodies, family. And I'm my heart, I'm trying not to cry while I'm talking to you about this right now. They were taking, it says, enslaved people's deaths were not complete financial losses to the owners, to their owners. Medical schools across the nation bought the bodies of deceased enslaved people from Southern slave owners for dissection and research, and thereby offer slave owners a profitable way to make such bodies disappear. Yeah, I gotta keep going. I told you this chapter is heavy. It's really heavy. So it says the brutality of slave owning women, especially when it led to disfigurement or death, might strike as irrational destruction that was counterproductive in large part because it seemed to be in direct conflict with their financial investment in the people they owned. After all, such violence impaired enslaved people's ability to work and deceased and obliterated their value in the market. But slave owning women's decision to abuse, maim, and kill her slaves was simply an extreme version of her right to exclude others from reaping the benefits of having access to the slaves herself abused and destroyed. So she basically saying, I'm going to do it. You're not going to do it. I'm going to do it. And it says, moreover, there were benefits that accrued from such actions, and they served an important purpose for slave owning women and their communities. The abuse and murder of enslaved people had expressive value that affirmed a slave owning woman's power. It was so expressive because some slave owning women enacted this violence in ritualized performances and forced enslaved men, women, and children to watch as a way of further convincing them of their power. Pause. Typically, family, in movies that depict slavery, they show the white slave master bringing a captive out in front of everybody to see. And that white slave master would beat, it'd be a white male slave master, and they would beat our enslaved, that enslaved person or that captive in front of the men, women, and children at plantation, right? In order to reaffirm his power. It's telling you right here in this book, it was not just white men, it was also white women who did that. And she says it was violence in ritualized performances. Okay? Ritual. So this was a ritual where she would grab somebody and just beat them in front of the other men, women, and children to reaffirm her power. It wasn't just white men. So it said broader social order was another important benefit by invoking terror in enslaved populations. Slave owners and their communities increased the likelihood that they could exact submission from enslaved people. When enslaved people fled beyond their owners' reach, Southern laws endowed members of the militias, community patrols, and ordinary white Southerners with the power to destroy them and display their remains, such as the heads of decapitated rebels, in public. So I ask you a question, family. Tell me about these good white people, family. I ask you, family. Tell me about these good white people that you all love to talk about. No, it's good white people, Dr. Ma. What you talking about? These are good white people, Dr. Ma. The good white folks. Did you hear? So you got these white folks out here who say things like, you have these white folks out here who say things like, I didn't own a slave. My family didn't own. My family didn't own. We didn't own. Well, what the hell was your family doing? What the hell was your family doing when people owned slaves in the South and the North? Let's not let the North off the hook. What were your family members doing? They were participating in the maintenance of the institution of slavery because it could not have happened for decades, for centuries, without the participation of the broader community. It says community sought to sanction slave owners who refused to punish their slaves, who allowed their slaves too much freedom. All right, family. So at the end of this chapter, page 80, it says this. It's a whole paragraph, but I want to read the last two sentences. It says white women were members of slave owning communities built on a system of white supremacy in the subjugation of African descended people. I want to say this again. These white women, these slave holding, slave owning white women, mistresses, they were members of a slave owning communities built on a system of white supremacy and the subjugation of African descended people. The same system of white supremacy that we still experience today, that they try to say that doesn't exist. That's why you have DeSantis and them. They're passing the woke act. Shout out to Baba. I mean, we had a beautiful bill yesterday entitled "Becoming Woke." Being woke is now considered bad, and we broke down the origins of the word woke. We talked about how they're trying to hijack it and make it something that it's not. And so anyway, in doing so, they call it woke ideology. So they don't want us to believe, family, anymore, that such a system exists. Such a system existed yesterday, and it still exists today. As Sister Crystal Denise said in the chat, to this day. So anyway, family, I was going to open up the line. And drop the link in the chat, but I didn't realize I went for an hour in 30 minutes, just kind of going ham on this particular chapter. But I was definitely reading your comments in the chat. And Sister Crystal, I kept that on the screen for a reason, the casual killing act. And I want to make sure I write that down in my book, because you're right. Let me see. Brutalized enslaved deaths were a complete financial loss. We just starts talking about them actually killing us. The different laws. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna put it here. Law forbade them to testify. Yeah, so I'm gonna put that down here. Yep, I remember that. The Casual Killing Act. Thank you so much, Sister Crystal. I kept that on the screen. I'm going to put that at the bottom of page 77. Bottom of page 77. So anyway, family, make sure you join me back here at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next Sunday to discuss chapter 4. The title of chapter 4, family, it says she thought she could find a better market. That's the title of the chapter. She thought she could find a better market. And so it looks like chapter 4 is it looks like it's shorter than what we are. Well, no, it's still like 19 pages. So it's still kind of lengthy. But yeah, we're in chapter 4. So after next week, we're going to be halfway through this book, family. So join me back here next week at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to discuss chapter 4 of They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South by Dr. Stephanie Jones Rogers. I appreciate all of you for hanging with me. I appreciate you. I appreciate you so much. You all hanging in, and I see a lot of you in the building. You hung with me, Sister Crystal and the Queen Mother Almina. I see you, Darnette. She hung with me. Goddess Yemi Yai, where was you, Goddess? I was looking for you at the beginning. Yemi Yai in the building. I see the Goddess Yemi Yai. She's in the building. I see Blockchain. He hung. The troopers, the Maadian family, man, y'all hung. Y'all always hung. A beautiful mind. I see you in the building, beloved. Make sure, family, that you thumb up this video before you get out of here. Thumb up the video. Also share this video. You see they're messing with the numbers there. I mean, I guarantee you some people probably don't even know that I'm live right now. That's how much they're censoring Black voices on social media. I'm at a point where I'm like, I'll invest in my own website and streaming platform. I know people got their issues with brother Tariq Nasheed, but he does have a streaming platform that he's built. And to be honest with you, instead of complaining about what YouTube censoring us, they're censoring us here. It's time to collectively just grab a server and we stream and we put our content on our own server. That's where we should be doing. I'm actually tired of hearing the complaints. We always complain they doing this and they doing that and they doing and they're going to keep on doing because they're trying to maintain their power. They're trying to maintain their power by controlling the narratives. The narratives, remember, narratives dictate reality, right? So they want to control the narratives. They want to continue to define and dictate our reality. And so the only way, family, that we can stop that from happening is to, as Dr. Amos Wilson said, develop the power to end our victimization. That's what he said. He said, we will forever be oppressed. He said, until we develop the power, until we develop the ability to end that victimization. So, family, we got to stop complaining. We got to stop complaining. Let's work more, complain less. I think that's a t-shirt. Let's work more and complain less. I said that to Dr. Boyce Watkins on his IG page when he put up a post of, Florida schools, 55 Florida schools have zero proficiency in reading. I just put under there, I said, we know. I said, let's start pushing and promoting solutions. Enough with the complaining. Let's start pushing and promoting solutions. There was another female, I forgot her name. You all probably know her. She does political commentary. She put up a post and she said, oh, look at what they're doing with the textbooks. They're talking about Rosa Parks and they are omitting race from what she did. They just saying that she sat on the bus. She was tired. She refused to give up her seat. She's a great human being, right? And it's actually a CNN article. Sister Amina, Queen Mother, put that article, drop that link in the chat. But she, so anyway, this sister that does political commentary, and you probably know who I'm talking about. She's with Charlemagne the God. She does some things with him, and she put up a post. Oh, they're changing Black history. I said, simply buy Meltrek for your children. Buy Meltrek. I said, Meltrek is a program, right, of films. It's films, books, curricula that teaches Black history. So let's stop the complaining. They're doing this, they're doing that, and let's continue to build family. All right. So thumb up the video. Also, family, subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Hit the notification bell so that whenever I go live, yes, that's who she is, Teslin. Thank you, Queen Mother. Yes, Teslin. That was the sister that put up the post regarding Rosa Parks. And I put under there, if you go to the comments, you'll see my little comment. I'm like, And people started liking it. Like, just white folks are going to always be white folks. So do we continue to complain or do we move accordingly? And that's where we are, family. So anyway, I do appreciate you all hanging with me. Again, thumb up the video, subscribe to the channel. We'll be here. I'll be here next week, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to discuss chapter 4 of They Were Her Property. All right. I do plan on going live at least one time this week. So make sure you hit the notification bell so that you are notified whenever I do go live. If I don't see you this week, family, I'll see you next Sunday. If I don't see you this week, during the week, and I'll see you next Sunday. Have a beautiful Blacktastic week. Peace and Black power.